Chapter 2. Personal Involvement. The first aircraft I ever flew was a Miles Magister, number L6912. I was airborne for 35 minutes, and fortunately for me, my instructor, one Flight Lieutenant Freeman, was the chief instructor at Mere Elementary Flying Training School. Chief instructors' pupils do not fail. After I had done 8 hours and 9 minutes duel and was making yet another of my innumerable attempts to perform a decent landing, I suddenly heard an irate shout through the speaking tube. "All right, I've got her!" And I felt the stick wrenched from my hand. "What's the matter, man?" the bellowing continued. "Are you scared? Are you frightened when you come in to land?" "No, sir," I managed timorously. "Well, you bloody well ought to be, because I am." He put her down and we climbed out. He stared at me with a long, baffled look. I knew what was in his mind. With less hours to their credit than I had, quite a number of fellow pupils had already soloed. But chief instructor's pupils do not fail. "I don't seem to have the ability to teach you how to fly, Kelly," Freeman said after a pause which had seemed endless. "Maybe someone else has." And he turned on his heel and stalked off to the dispersal hut. Thereafter I had no less than 3 further instructors, all sergeant pilots. By the time I had done 12 hours and 45 minutes duel, everyone else in the course had either gone solo or been plowed. In desperation, I was given a flight commander's test. Theoretically, this was crunch point, but Pilot Officer Plunkett understood that chief instructor's pupils do not fail, and wisely passed the buck. "I think you'd better have one more try," he said. "I'll leave it to your instructor to decide." So it was back to Sergeant Pilot Eastwood. He gave me an hour and quarter's non-stop duel, surely a mere record. After the umpteenth landing, he taxied in. In the slough of despond, I undid my straps. "Do them up again," I heard through the rubber tube. "And for my sake, if not your own, try not to kill yourself." After Mere, I went to number 8 Flying Training School at Montrose. It was a bitter winter. There was snow on the ground when we arrived, and as far as I recall, there was still snow on the ground when I left for my operational training unit. Our dispersal huts were, I always believed, up-ended aircraft crates, and never discarding any part of our flying kit, we used to huddle round a ridiculously inadequate stove with numbed hands, feet, and noses, with only thin wooden boarding to protect us from the howling gales, the föhn, the blizzards. One night we had such a heavy fall of snow that clearly desperate measures were called for. The station commander was equal to the task. He had us all, every man jack, officers, NCOs and other ranks, instructors, pupils, ground staff, lined up at one end of the airfield. We stretched across its entire width with him in the center and a few paces ahead of us. "Right," he commanded. "March!" And march we did, from one end of the airfield to the other, with the station commander, a brave and unforgettable figure in flying boots, peaked cap, and long greatcoat tails streaming out behind, leading us. We looked most impressive, a long unbroken line abreast of perhaps 1,000 men. Years later I was to be reminded of our performance when in Dr. Zhivago the whites poured from the forest across the snowy steppes to attack the Reds. When we reached the end, we turned to survey the results of our endeavors, to be rewarded by the sight of a few footprints in the snow. We flew Miles Masters at Montrose, an unpleasant and unforgiving aircraft, with such a horrible yanking twist when spinning that even the instructors were loath to demonstrate how to recover. I never forgot the sensation, nor did I forget low flying. Number 19 in the sequence of training was instrument flying. This was a boring occupation. The pupil practicing it pulled a hood over himself and flew around blind on instruments, while another pupil acted as safety pilot. My normal companion, a man named Wilson, was as mad as a hatter for whom 5 minutes under the hood was more than enough. Thereafter we did low flying. Summarized, this consisted of aiming at pairs of trees less than a wingspan apart, and at the last moment banking steeply to fly between them, or, even more terrifying, doing steep turns at 0 feet. I never forgot those steep turns. The wingtips seemed almost to be boring a hole in the ground, and the master, at the limit of its patience, juddering on the verge of an incipient spin. Death was half a second distant by the tiniest misjudgment. I was terrified out of my wits. I hated it. But, of course, when it was my turn to do instrument flying, I did the same. There seemed no option. Then one day, instead of my usual companion, I had a man named Willis. He no more wanted to low fly than I wanted him to. But such was the form that, having heard about the early exploits, he supposed he should. Willis's approach was gentlemanly. He found a nice level stretch of ground crossed by stone walls, and these he proceeded to, as it were, hop over like a dignified racehorse remembering its younger days at Aintree. Ahead, a long way ahead, parallel to this series of stone walls, was the edge of a forest of fir trees. As we drew nearer to them, I presumed that Willis would have seen them. As we drew nearer still, hoped he had, and finally realized it didn't matter whether he had or not, as we were going to go straight through the top of them, which we did. One moment the blue sky had vanished and all was green, and then we were through and all was blue again. In my ears I heard an anguished cry, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" I couldn't see what the fuzz was about and said so. "Look at the wings! Look at the wings!" I looked at the wings. They were indeed a sorry sight. From gaping holes, fabric streamed like torn paper blown from barbed wire in a gale. "I can't hold her! I can't hold her!" Willis yelled. I remember to this day wondering why he said everything twice. I gave him a hand. With both of us forcing the stick to the right, we managed to equalize the lack of lift caused by the greater area of missing fabric on the port mainplane. So we progressed, discussing what to do. We discussed bailing out after heading the aircraft towards the coast, leaving the sea to hide the evidence of our crime. But the master was an unforgiving brute, and I was quite sure would have meanly turned back on its tracks and given us away. So we abandoned this proposal and labored on. Now new problems arose. We had lost our pitot head and hence had no idea of our airspeed, and the radiator temperature had begun to rise. Slithering onto course by use of rudder, the ailerons being fully employed in keeping the aircraft level, we headed for Montrose. Here a new problem beset us. With all courses well behind schedule through the filthy winter weather and the sky filled with other masters making the most of today's perfect conditions, the danger of a sideways-on collision with other pilots coming into land, which could hardly be expected to keep much of an eye out to starboard, was very real, for the circuit was of course an anti-clockwise one, and we could only turn clockwise, and that by dint of centralizing the stick. But it was Hobson's choice. While Aldous lamps flashed at us and the red candles from very pistols prettily filled the sky in our vicinity, instructing each other who was to do what, we slithered on rudder around the corners. One-handed forced the stick where it just didn't want to go, while nervously lowering wheels and flaps with the other, and made some sort of excess speed landing, ground looped twice and taxied in. A small knot of pupils and instructors were eyeing us and our tattered machine with interest, and from this knot our own instructor, a man called Wooldridge, detached himself. He did not come to us as we sat frozen with disquiet in our cockpits, but going round to the front of the master, put his hand into the radiator and withdrew from it a fir cone. "Yes," he observed quietly, "you're for the high jump, all right." The upshot was better than it might have been. Willis was court-martialed, but the star prosecution witness, myself, had gone down with pneumonia and was in Courtacre Castle. He got off with a hefty fine. It was, of course, quite asinine for my usual partner to do this barnstorming, and even more stupid of me to allow myself to be dragooned into following suit. But as it happened, it was an exercise I was to be everlastingly grateful to have practiced. Had I not learned how to aim at trees not a wingspan apart and then turn through them, one day the remains of my hurricane, with myself amongst it, would have been hidden forever by the Sumatran jungle. From Montrose I went to number 56 OTU at Sutton Bridge, where the commanding officer was a wing commander, now Air Marshal Sir Harold Maguire, whose path I was to cross again and much later and in far more dramatic circumstances. Maguire had been operational over France, but the only story of that time I've been able to winkle out of this very modest man was of his first victory when, attacking the leading ME-109 of a pair in line astern, he failed to allow enough deflection and shot the rear one down instead. History was in a way to repeat itself in Sumatra when, attacked by a pair of Japanese fighters, he was to see, to his great delight and relief, the rearmost one shoot down the leader instead of himself, leaving him and another Hurricane pilot to shoot the second one down in turn. Nothing remarkable or outrageous happened to me at Sutton Bridge, and in fact the only problem I remembered having was on my first solo in a hurricane, when the undercarriage refused to come down. Magisters and Masters, Tiger Moths and Harvards are all two-seater aircraft. You make your first flight in company with another pilot experienced in flying them. He demonstrates what to do, the effect of throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, flaps. The demand on you is limited, but there are no two-seater Hurricanes and Spitfires. You are faced with the unknown, and you must handle the unknown alone. You sit in the cockpit apprehensive of all the knobs and dials and switches, more than you have seen before. Your heart is pumping at such a rate that no doctor examining you would contemplate your flying at all. There are a score of questions you meant to ask you have quite forgotten, and a score more which flit through your mind but you dare not ask because they seem so puerile. The man standing on the wing root, his shoulder higher than your head, inquires if you've got it all, and you smile a weak and unconvincing affirmative. He nods, jumps down, and walks away. You put your helmet on, plug in the oxygen and radio connections. Self-consciously, you raise your thumb to the watching ground staff. They signal back. You press self-starter. The propeller turns, slowly at first, unwillingly. The engine coughs, snorts, kicks into life. The ground staff unplug the starter trolley and wheel it away. You are on your own. This first essay will never be forgotten. You taxi out, bumping on the rough grass. All you can see in front of you are the cockpit instruments, the gun sight, the windshield, and the sky, for the nose of the hurricane blocks out the way ahead. Gingerly, you adopt a serpentine course, swinging first to port and then to starboard. The more you open the throttle, the easier the swinging becomes, but you must take care not to overdo it. You reach the boundary, the takeoff point. You turn crosswind, scanning the sky over your shoulder, half hoping another hurricane will be coming in to land, granting you a few more moments' respite. But the sky is empty, the airfield ahead is clear. You do your drill. BRAFT. Petrol tanks full, retractable undercarriage down, air screw pitching fine, flap lever up, trim neutral. Okay, all okay. You bring round the nose with a burst of throttle and left rudder. Now is the moment. The initial interview, the marching up and down at Babbacombe, the sleepy summer days in a Cambridge college learning aircraft recognition, Morse code, navigation, the last chance at Mere, the fir trees of Angus, these are all behind. These have finally brought you to this moment. The throttle ball is a solid thing beneath the layers of gloves on your left hand. You slide it forward, then farther, farther still. The engine roars. The propeller becomes a blur. As the hurricane begins to move, the nose comes down and the way ahead is clear. You check with a touch of right rudder, a slight tendency to swing, and then, suddenly, as if you had no part in it yourself, you are airborne. You take hand off throttle to raise the undercarriage lever, and the astonishing thing is your lack of clumsiness. The stick is so sensitive it needs only the merest pressure to adjust a slight wing drop. With satisfaction, you see the green light go out, the red bear take their place. The wheels are safely locked away, the aircraft is freed of their impediment. Now it is pure joy. The power, the rate of climb, the sensitivity of engine and controls. You look along the wing, shifting the stick, watching the ailerons rise and fall. The fuselage is fabric, but the wings are metal, tough, row upon row of rivets, stretching towards the red and blue roundels near the wingtips. You try the elevators, rudder, and both are obedient to the slightest pressure. You realize you are in control, that you can fly her, that here is an aircraft without vices, considerate, reassuring. Any fear of the first landing quite disappears. There are margins of control and safety such as were never to be found in the previous machines you flew. You look down at the ground below, marveling at the height so quickly gained, and something happens to you, an onrush of personal pride such as you had never imagined, and your eyes are filled with tears, for this is the greatest moment you have ever known. I do not remember whether on that first solo it was a requirement that we should practice lowering the undercarriage whilst on our familiarization flight, or whether it was only that on coming into land I discovered that apparently only one leg of my undercarriage was willing to come down. I do remember that having made this discovery, I climbed to a considerable height in order to sort the problem out. Although this was early April, the sky was very misty, indeed more like the sky of a hot summer's day, and the horizon was a limited one. Sutton Breach was busy, and it made no sense to drift around in such poor visibility when in a few minutes I could climb into clearer air away from all risk collision. So this I set about doing. The remarkable thing was that I felt not the least misgivings. Already completely confident of the hurricane's capacity, I felt sure I should find the answer. In fact, at several thousand feet, I abandoned the attempt at finding clearer air, and I'm fairly certain, although after all these years not positive, that I contacted the ground to seek advice and was instructed how to pump the stubborn oleo leg down. I do not suggest this is a difficult thing to do, but on a first solo in a far more complex and powerful aircraft than has been flown before, impeded within the confines of a tiny cockpit by the quite new attachments of oxygen and radio tubes and wires, on a murky day with little horizon, the problems should have all been magnified. They were not. Very much to my own astonishment, I felt no qualms at all, and in due course persuaded the recalcitrant undercarriage to behave, and landed without trouble. I put all this down to the quiet confidence the hurricane then, and henceforth, imbued in me. I was to do quite a lot of flying in different climates and conditions, but I never had an engine failure, never forced landed, and never found this delightful aircraft fail to respond to anything I asked of it.